Tuli, if you could answer one question for me there. You specifically referenced satellite education. And as you know, we have 5 of the islands that have second-level schools, every one of which have high-speed broadband. In fairness, Minister Pat Rabbitte at the time delivered that and started with the islands first. How has the use of broadband developed the range of subjects in those 5 schools? Now, you may not be able to answer that to now, and I'm not putting you under the pin of your collar today, but it would be interesting if Codal could come back to us and see how has broadband changed the delivery of the subject range for students on those 5 islands, so that we could then look at replicating that, because I think that's a significant element. And I know that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think quite a number of the island schools come under the education and training boards, which would mean that there's a responsibility on the ETBs to provide that broad range, not just for islands. I represent a part of the country in East Galway where we have a lot of small second-level schools with limited subject range, and we're not using the broadband capacity that's there. Some of the ETBs that are covering a number of island communities as well as my part of East Galway. But if you could maybe come back to the committee on that specific issue, not necessarily today, but at a later date. Thanks. Sorry for cutting across you.
No problem. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are a lot of potential with shared resources and the broadband connectivity, especially when we have fibre cable on the islands. And there are a lot of good examples on this all around the world already. There are schools currently operating entirely online, but a combination of local resources and shared resources, perhaps even across different rural communities, the islands, but why not also other rural communities for the special subjects, is definitely the way ahead.
Thanks. Can I come in there? So thanks, Tuli.
Sorry, Aisling, just anyone that's coming in remotely, if you could just introduce yourselves, because it just makes it easier for transcribing here, just to give your name, because it mightn't just be clear to us here who's actually speaking.
Yeah, perfect. No hassle. It's Aisling Moore, Chair of Cógal Uileán here. And so thank you very much for having us here today and for reviewing the Sustainable Development Goals. I think it's really important for all of us. On housing, which is one of the biggest issues, and thanks for raising it. I think the first thing to address with housing is we have a housing issue. So, and we have a housing issue for islanders, as Tully said. And I appreciate that the question that Mark O'Callaghan asked is, if you have affordable housing, how do you stop it from going into holiday homes? How do you stop that all over the country? Like, we've looked at this, time and time again. It's a difficult one. We can't be the judges or the people to come down and say, well, you can't sell your house to somebody, or if it does, it has to be at a national level or a national policy. We need to solve the problem of housing first. That would be my answer, and it has to be addressed on all different levels, with social housing, affordable housing, planning, gateway housing, which is a new way. So we talk about affordable housing, and that's just a system we know about, but we don't talk about gateway housing, which might be housing within a community that is supported to let people live within a community for a couple of years, and then if the planning laws were there, that they could build on their own. So I think we have a long way to come with the Sustainable Development Goals around housing. I think we can look at all of those aspects around housing with the Sustainable Development Goals, and we've got another report, a national housing report coming out that's done by UCC. We've also got the National Islands Policy, and I would hope that over the next couple of years that much more of the Sustainable Development Goals would be hit by implementation of some of the recommendations out of both those reports. But we'd appreciate, as we say, it all needs financial support as well within that, and constant reviewing. So I just want to know, do any of my other colleagues want to comment on or answer any of the questions that were posed by Deputy O'Callaghan there?
John or Simon, do you want to come in on either of those?
John Walsh from Bear Island. I'd have to agree with Aisling as well. It is very difficult to control the selling of houses. I think there's a multi-action needed to solve the housing crisis in the islands, and I think the island policy will help in doing it. But to actually say to someone you can't sell your house to a certain person, I think that has huge implications to the island communities. But when I looked at the Sustainable Development Goals when we were developing our own strategic plan for Bear Island, Whiddy Island and Dursey Island, just say two main things that came into view for us. And when we're talking about different Sustainable Development Goals, say Sustainable Development Goal 6, clean water and sanitation. In the last month I've been on 3 islands, Whiddy Island, Inisheer and Clare Island yesterday, and the 3 islands don't have drinkable water, which in this day and age is shocking to say. Also under infrastructure, again, like Clare Island yesterday, Runa Pier, shocking, coming out of Clare Island into Runa Pier from either Inishturk or Clare Island, that there isn't in this day and age a proper facility for them to land on. It just, again, it goes to show that since 2015, the goals don't take into account islands. And again, Inisheer Pier on it a few weeks ago, probably the busiest pier in Ireland, I would say. I know my colleague Paddy Crowe, for many years, he was trying to get the pier done there. Chloe O'Malley's working on it at the moment, and hopefully there'll be news soon. And again, looking at Sustainable Development Goal 5, gender equality on the islands, again, we do not have access to services like family resource centres. I think Bear Island, where I live myself, is the only island that we actually do work with, Bear West Family Resource Centre, but I don't think any other island gets services of a family support worker. And again, the SICAP programme, which is supposed to be for every resident of the state, again, the West Cork Islands get it because Cork County Council actually made a lot of the islands, so when they were tendering it out, Cornellan was able to apply for it. But the other islands don't have that service, which is again, the state is kind of lacking in service to the island under social inclusion. So just on them points there, just to raise that, I think it's important to say it.
Thank you. Simon, do you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I suppose just a couple of things that are, I suppose, underneath the surface of all conversations in relation to islands, and that's cost, the cost of living on an island. And we operate a subsidised system in this country, rightly so, in order to try and keep the islands alive and our communities alive, because of the benefits they give back through tourism and many other avenues. But I suppose our subsidised system for freight, if you're not familiar with it, puts the cost of living up on the islands, which is a bizarre statement, but that's the truth. So if you have a subsidised system, it should not be increasing the cost of living on the island. And we're talking about housing there, which you've all touched on. So through a subsidised system, in order to build a house here or renovation or whatever it may be, any works to a house, you're looking at, because of the system that's in place, you're looking at a 30% increase on the cost of building. And that's just not good enough. So if we are being serious about islands, and we've had our policy document launched there a couple of weeks ago, but if we're being serious about the continuation of life on our islands, and we have lost many islands over the years, and we're now left with a very small number. So we don't have the population to make an argument. I mean, that's the key principle of rural living, full stop. So if it's going to be all based on population, well, then that's not going to work for us. So the nuances have to be to look at islands in the context of we want islands to survive off our coast. Being an island nation, you think that would be an obvious thing. But that has to be met with, in every department, county council and structures, basically, of the government system in this country. And if we have to be still arguing at this stage in 2023, I'm not sure how much forward we've gone, you know. So if you're talking about housing and health and everything else, if you have a system that's in place, that's run by the state, that's putting up the costs of living on an island, then that has to be addressed. And I would ask the committee, if it's within your remit, that someone needs to do root and branch review of the subsidised system for the islands, because it's just, it's a little bit out of control, and it's killing productivity on the islands. So if we're hoping to house people and we're hoping for a future for the islands, then we need to address the costs that we can address immediately, and this is one that could be done immediately. This is a review that could be carried out. The tendering process could be changed, new tender document in place, bang, that's it. Cost of living comes down on the island. Simple thing like that make a huge difference.
Thanks very much. Louise Lennon from Irish Rural Link.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you for inviting us today. And as the Chair said, Louise Lennon from Irish Rural Link, and I'm here I'm attending today with the Coalition 2030. I suppose just in general with the SDGs, and I suppose the Department of Rural and Community Development would be, I suppose, our main department we'd deal with, just around, their progress on the SDGs, and I suppose just looking back on their overall policy and strategy of our rural future. A lot of the actions are around sustainable communities and decent work, but it seems to lack that whole poverty piece and equality. And I think, for the next policy, they're starting to think about the next 5-year strategy as well, that needs to be included. You heard from my colleagues that rural areas are very, they have higher income inadequacies. The homes are harder to heat, and I think that needs to be addressed across government. Just picking up on some of the questions Deputy Donnelly had asked or referred to, just around the whole education piece, and I suppose digital and the broadband and the difficulties during COVID. And we've called for a long time for high-speed broadband, and welcome that it is being rolled out. But there's still parts that and still homes that are still without broadband, and the difficulty that caused, and it's still causing for homes or people trying to work from home. But it's more about, I suppose, having that equipment for lower income households and poorer households, that having the laptop or the computer, or having to share one piece of equipment between maybe 3 or 4 children in a family can cause difficulties. And also for older people, having the digital skills, and as I suppose we move to e-tech and e-health, I suppose we have an ageing population. Access to GPs has become more difficult for older people in rural areas. I suppose GPs are beginning to retire when they retire, and it's getting difficult to replace them in rural areas, and then having to travel. Then if they don't have access to a car, it can become more difficult. So I think the need for those enhancing the lifelong skills for people, and it has to go across the whole life cycle, so that they have the skills and are equipped to use technology and use, I suppose, technologies that can help them remain in their homes as they get older. I just also want to pick up, as Deputy Donnelly had mentioned, around waste management. And I suppose in rural areas it is more difficult as well for people, for not only the cost, but to manage their waste as well. Again, it is all private companies that are delivering the waste management services, recycling. But a lot of rural areas don't have those facilities even to them, and a lot don't have the brown bin isn't an option. And a lot of the argument is that, you know, if you contact your waste management service, you're told there's not enough people in the area using the service. So there could be 3 or 4 bin lorries out a week, but they're all from different companies. So not having that service available to people is increasing the cost. Then the food goes into the black bin, we'll say, or the general waste bin, and it is pushing up the cost for people. Just as well on some of a few other things, just around the whole, again, the transport still remains a major issue for people in rural areas. Access to public transport, you know, it's, if we're serious about achieving the SDGs, you know, the climate targets, you know, reducing poverty, you know, because transport for people in rural areas is a major cost. So there needs to be proper investment in rural transport, and I suppose in ensuring that it is I suppose adaptable to the community needs and the local needs of that area. Just I suppose the SDGs as well, bringing them in, you know, how can communicating them out more to people in rural areas as well, like the PPNs are there, you know, so ensuring that, you know, that it's brought in with the PPNs, and it can, you know, that they're aware of them as well, and their knowledge is up to date on it. And there's also now town teams being developed. So ensuring that they have access to the information, and that it's easily accessible, and I suppose in plain language as well. Like a lot of people on PPNs, a lot of people on these town teams are volunteers. They're from the local community. So making sure, you know, the language used is accessible to everyone will be important. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Paul Cannell, you want to answer some of those questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Deputy Donnelly as well for his points he raised. I just wanted to come back to one of the key issues which links to the issue about affording quality food, healthy food, but it also links to affordability in terms of education, other services and other areas that people need access to in their lives. Just a key point for us would be in relation to income adequacy being at the basis of a lot of the unaffordability of healthy food, of access to education and so on, that impacts on a lot of, and transport, other areas that impacts on a lot of families across the country. I don't know if you're aware of the minimum essential standard of living researchers carried out previously with the Ascension Partner for Social Justice, and now within the Vincent de Paul. And they have published recently their updated data for 2022, which shows that in terms of the 214 household types that are depending on social welfare that they researched in 2022, 127 of those will experience deep income inadequacy in terms of affording a minimum essential standard of living. 60 will have an inadequate income, and 27 just will be able to afford an adequate income according to what's a minimum essential standard of living. And that takes into account the cost of goods and services. So as people, as they become more affordable or accessible, it impacts on the minimum essential standard of living. So it's extremely important in the first case, and this is relevant for this committee in a wider context, not just in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, is that the social welfare levels are adequate for people to be able to afford a minimum essential standard of living. And just to be able to stand still this year, organisations across the sector based on that research are calling for €27.50 on social welfare rates. Now that's a big ask, but that's just for people to be able to stand still based on the impact of inflation over the last year or so. and that's not even moving towards a minimum essential standard of living. And that impacts on households and across a range of access to services and support. So I think it's extremely important then in making that point in relation to the government's targets or how it's meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. The other point I wanted to make is to look a little bit about the overall achievement of targets, which is raised earlier by Deputy O'Cahasey as well. While it may be reported that the government is meeting its overall poverty target in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, that, as we mentioned earlier, as mentioned by other colleagues, that we know the poverty levels are rising more generally. But also it's extremely important in the context, and was mentioned by your Chair at introduction, it's about how the overall Sustainable Development Goals delivers for all groups across society as well. So even within those overall targets, there is the overall objective of leaving no one behind and reaching those furthest behind first. So that's why we have to look at it really in terms of not just overall targets, but how it's delivering for those subgroups. So that's why disaggregated data is extremely important. We know that there are gaps. We know that there are very high poverty levels, high levels of unemployment among certain groups in relation to SDG 8. But the disaggregated data, there are gaps, for example, in relation to ethnic identifiers. For some groups, traveller organisations and others have called for greater use of ethnic identifiers. We know what the gaps are and what access to health, for example, are for particular groups. The employment levels for people with disabilities, the latest data depends on the census. It must be more up to date than that. It's not adequate. The survey of income and living conditions misses out on certain groups in our society as well, such as travellers, other minorities, Roma, homeless people and so on. So while it's important that we achieve the targets for the overall population, it's also that the government sets its ambition for every group in society so that we leave no one behind. And that's why Coalition 2030 published that report, just to draw attention to the fact that while it's important to achieve the overall targets, we cannot leave anyone behind in how we're achieving those. So that's why the disaggregated data is important at that level, just so we're ensured that we're not leaving anyone behind, both in terms of our ambition, but in terms of how we measure our progress. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Bennett.
Thank you very much, and I might pass to my colleague in a moment as well. Just in relation to Deputy Donnelly's discussion around the digital divide, certainly, and I live quite near Louise, I live in rural Ireland, you couldn't move for broadband trucks up country roads during the pandemic because it was a real kind of sticking point where we suddenly realised just how bad things were. And while things have certainly improved, there are households who are still struggling with it. And particularly, when we start to kind of again disaggregate the data on it and we look in terms of ages, for example, we're seeing high levels of just very basic or low levels of digital literacy among our adult population. If we are to move towards more kind of, we've got an e-health strategy now, we're looking at e-public services, the people who cannot keep up with that are going to miss out on essential, critical services. And obviously, as our education system is becoming more digitised, it starts there, it starts young. There were great moves, and we welcome them very much in terms of primary school books and the subsidisation of those in Budget 23. But there needs to be more in relation to the digital needs of students, but also in terms of older people and more targeted supports there. In relation to the medical cards and the access to medical cards, I think there's probably two elements to it for us. The first is that we've been calling for a long time for the individualisation of welfare support, so that it's not based on your household income, but actually on what you yourself need. Because we know, for example, that not every household is happy and homogenous and works together and shares everything. We know that there are difficulties, and those difficulties need to be addressed. But also, based on studies at an international level, we're the only country that doesn't have a universal access to primary care. We've been calling for quite some time in relation to what's now community health care networks and community, but we're primary care networks. We very much welcome the 2016 publication of Sláinte Care, but we've only seen the infrastructure investment once, and that was during COVID, when the 500 million that was committed to every year for 6 years was actually allocated. That now needs to be ramped up. That is so out of date now. Those numbers are so out of date that needs to be addressed in terms of just access across the board. So you don't have those kind of dips and those areas that we all know of that you can be a fiver over your assessment. In relation to the quality education side and the DESH Plus, absolutely. I mean, there are still issues in DESH schools in terms of competing with peers in non-DESH schools, but we are seeing, and particularly since the massive increases in inflation, we're seeing much more disadvantage in what were mainstream schools. We're seeing kids coming to school with inadequate lunches, they can't concentrate. There's an explosion in terms of child mental health. We very much welcomed a recent announcement that there would be an increase for psychological supports at primary level, but it needs to be immediate because we know that there are inadequate SNA hours. We know that there are children who aren't getting full hours in school. They're on short days. That isn't addressing the kind of leaving people behind. They are our most vulnerable and they are being completely left behind. So certainly there needs to be additional supports at a mainstream level to ensure that people who have additional needs are actually getting them so that they can thrive. And then in relation to waste management, this brings, I suppose, a much bigger issue to focus. And Deputy, you were there when we launched our SEO, our socio-economic review in the AV room recently, and the issue of privatisation came up again and again and again. And this is part of that. When it was municipal offering a service that was provided as a kind of a public good, people got on with it. It was a job that people had with pride and they did their job. Once you start tendering for it, you start privatising it, the role that you privatise for becomes what was contained in your tender, and anything that wasn't contained in that is left behind. And that's why you have these disparities, you have these areas that aren't getting their green or their brown bins collected or don't have brown bins at all. I don't think I have a brown bin actually. But you start to constrict what you can actually get, and it leaves gaps. And it leaves gaps. Like I walked from Houston this morning, you've got bins left, right and centre up Dublin city centre. And it does, it then has a knock-on impact on everything else. But that's just one area of privatisation when this is a kind of much more systemic problem. Thank you.